The Bible has a major problem when it comes to archaeology. See, after the Israelite exodus from Egypt, the Bible describes their destination, Canaan, as a nightmare-fuel superpower. 7 nations mightier than Israel, armies like sand on the seashore with iron chariots, giants, walls reaching to the heavens. It's supposed to be so terrifying that even with 600,000 fighting-age men, Israel was wildly outnumbered and needed miracles from God just to survive, let alone conquer the land. But here's the problem. When archaeologists actually dig into Late Bronze Age Canaan, that world simply isn't there. Instead of mighty kingdoms, we find ghost towns. Instead of vast armies, we find villages so tiny that their entire fighting force wouldn't fill a school bus. But rather than weighing my word against your pastor's, let's go straight to the sources. See, I have spent months scouring through over 100 archaeological reports, books, and academic publications, compiling the latest archaeological data on every identifiable site mentioned in the Bible conquest narratives. And in this video, we're gonna go through each location, Jericho, Bethel, Hazor, Jerusalem, etc., and see just how big they actually were based on this archaeological evidence. Then we'll zoom out and look at the big picture to see if the Bible accurately describes Canaan in the Late Bronze Age, or if nothing fails like Bible history. The region of the world is the ancient Near East, more specifically the southern Levant, and the time period is the Late Bronze 2B, or the 13th century BCE. And we're going to be exploring the sizes of various locations mentioned in the Joshua conquest narrative. Quick caveat from future me, there are Christians who propose an earlier date for the Exodus. But not only does all of the stuff in this video largely still apply to an earlier date, but the early date brings with it a host of other problems, some of which I've already covered earlier in this series. Like the fact that Pi-Ramses, the city that the Israelites allegedly built according to the Bible, wasn't even built until the 13th century. But for any of this to make sense, we first need a quick crash course in archaeology. Archaeologists usually measure ancient sites in hectares. For reference, a hectare is 10,000 square meters, or about half the size of this city block in Fredericksburg, Texas. And they measure population densities in terms of people per hectare. So if you assume that each of these 7 houses here has an average family size of 4 people, then you get a population density of 28 people per hectare. The entire urban area of Waco, Texas is just over 23,000 hectares, and it has a population of about 194,000 people. Because it's so spread out, that's only an average of just over 8 people per hectare. By contrast, Manila is possibly the most densely populated city in the world today, reaching a population density of about 450 people per hectare. And one neighborhood in Dhaka packs 1,700 residents into a single hectare. So, given this massive range, when archaeologists look at ancient sites and try to estimate their populations, where do they even begin? Well, first they can take a look at known average family sizes and population densities in similar pre-modern agrarian societies to get a baseline. They can measure what percentage of a tell or ruin was covered by habitations versus how much of it is open courtyards, marketplaces, temples, etc. They look at how many houses there are per hectare and how much floor space there is per house. After all, there's kind of a minimum baseline amount of space that even the most easygoing people need in order to live without going insane, or for things like a bed and stuff like that. And then, if they're trying to get an upper bound maximum population estimate, they'll even measure things like the site's total grain and water storage capacity and how much food their fields and livestock could yield to see just how big of a population they could realistically sustain given the average human's minimum water and caloric requirements. As a general rule, in the ancient Near East, cities without walls tended to be more sparsely populated because they spread out into the fields, whereas fortified towns tended to cram their houses together inside walls and even built houses with multiple floors. But after a century of excavations and thousands of in-depth analyses, archaeologists have found that as a general rule of thumb, the average Bronze Age Levantine city had a population density between 100 and 200 people per hectare. Now, there are a few slightly higher exceptions, and there were densely populated cities like Tel and Nazba later in the Iron Age, but even it only reached about 300 people per hectare across the entire 3.2 hectare site. And all of this creates a massive problem for Christian apologists, because most of the sites that we'll be looking at only occupied a tiny regional footprint. They need these biblical cities to match the biblical picture and at least be large enough to field standing armies as described in the Conquest of Joshua. The Bible gives exact census data for the Israelite army. Over 600,000 fighting age men. Add women and children to the mix, and it puts the number closer to 2 million people. About 40,000 of their troops crossed over the Jordan River to carry out the conquest. And it claims that the land that they were going into vastly outnumbered them. Now, the first problem that we have here is that the entire populations of the two Egyptian cities which different apologists claim that these 2 million Israelites left from were both way too tiny. So, the first thing apologists need to do is to drive up the size of one of these cities. To see just how they do this, I sat down with the archaeologist, author, and associate professor of classics and religious studies at the University of Iowa, Dr. Robert Cargill.
I also spend a lot of time looking at individuals who attempt to take the archaeological findings of these very credible archaeologists who have been working on these sites for decades. And then they like to say, well, the findings of these archaeologists, they don't match what the Bible claims, or it doesn't really fit the conquest model, let's say in Joshua. What can we do to pick apart the archaeological findings? Is there a variable that we can fudge? Is there a variable we can change? So then we can begin to, in little ways, make it fit possibly these conquest narratives. And one of these things they do is with population density, because unlike a date that something was destroyed, which people still try to cheat, right? These types of things, how large was the city? How many people were in it at the time? These are a little easier to cheat than when something was destroyed.
And this here is exactly what the Christian apologist and the Egyptologist Dr. David Falk does to inflate the numbers of the city he claims the Israelites left from.
When we look at, say, the demographics of, say, Avaris, Montfort Beatock estimated that the population was between 20 and 50,000. But the actual size of the site is 250 hectares. It's actually a really big site. And if we look at, say, the population of a Semitic city like Lehun, where the demographics are well known, they had a population density of 800 persons per hectare. We can estimate that, say, the population of Avaris was probably at least in the 200,000s.
But here's what he's not telling you. Lehun wasn't a normal city. It was a workers' village built from the ground up as a construction town. It required that the most advanced empire on Earth supply centralized grain rations for this concentrated specialized labor force. The workers didn't grow their own food. And still, these extreme densities only applied to the 2.5 hectare Sechem district, which was like the workers' dorm, not to the entire site. You're not going to replicate these conditions elsewhere without highly advanced supply chains. And even then, you may be able to cram 500 or 600 people into a hectare for a few blocks, but scaling that across an entire city? Without modern sanitation and waste disposal, disease becomes the real population cap.
Bring out your date!
Pack humans together beyond a certain threshold, and dysentery brings those numbers right back down. Scaling population densities of 800 people per hectare across the entire 250 hectare region of Avaris in the Late Bronze Age? Are you insane?
Oh, I've wasted my life.
When you start looking at things like cramming people together and saying, oh no, this city was much more compact and that's how you get more people and therefore it fits the... I would say stick with the people who are actually doing the research there, who are actually doing the excavations and publishing the reports, and not the folks who are trying to examine it from the outside, or maybe like me, went to dig there for 1 year, and now all of a sudden I'm going to challenge the findings of Amnon Ben Tor to say, no, actually I know better. That's the way to do it. Just because I might be part of an organization whose mission is to say the findings in the Bible must be true, and all of the archaeological findings that don't match the Bible, they have to be false.
But now let's move on to the cities that Joshua allegedly conquered. And here, the Christian apologist and young earth creationist Dr. Titus Kennedy tries to pull exactly the same fastball. In his doctoral dissertation, he attempted to estimate these cities' populations, but realizing that their surface areas were way too tiny to fit the biblical narrative, he simply went with a population density coefficient roughly 2 to 3 times greater than the archaeological standard for almost every single one of these 25 sites, including for locations that were entirely abandoned at the time. At this point, if I had been the one reviewing Kennedy's doctoral thesis, I would have given it an F. And here's the thing. If you actually stop and read the archaeological reports for these sites, you find that Beth Shean only had late bronze occupation in the upper region of the mound. Jericho was completely destroyed in the Middle Bronze Age, and though re-inhabited, was massively scaled down during the late bronze. But that didn't stop Kennedy from taking these locations' largest footprint during their most expansive period and simply multiplying that by absurdly unrealistic population coefficients. And the most egregious example of this, well, besides the entirely abandoned cities, is the city of Lachish, where his population estimates are substantially higher than the archaeological estimate for the entire 1,000 square kilometer region. How do I know all of this? Because unlike Titus Kennedy, I actually hate myself enough to go through every single one of these reports. And if you appreciate my life more than I do and the gargantuan effort that it takes to compile all of this information and create videos like this, you can support my work with a one-time PayPal donation or an ongoing pledge on patreon.com/holykool-aid. Or just smash that subscribe button. But I'm not done with Dr. Kennedy. Not yet, because next we've got the city of Dor, whose king Joshua allegedly defeated. Dor occupies an 8.5 hectare footprint. Kennedy pegs it at 10. Fine, that's not that far off. But then he says that because of erosion and rising sea levels, the city was likely twice this size, Dumbledore! Placing it at 20 hectares. Before multiplying this entire expanded area by nearly 600 people per hectare. What does he base this on? Well, not the data, because we actually know exactly how much of the coastline has eroded away. It's about 80 meters. And we have underwater archaeological surveys which have found an Iron Age mole from just after this time period, about 20 meters out. But they have yet to find evidence of any Bronze Age underwater structures. At the very most, you can add maybe another 4 or 5 hectares to the site. But the archaeologists at Dor also dug all along the eastern and southern sides of Dor, all the way down to virgin sand, and found zero evidence of any Bronze Age structure. And in the middle of the tell, below the Iron Age level, they just found a Bronze Age dump site, the kind that you might find outside of a city, leading them to believe that during the Late Bronze Age, Dor likely only occupied a small region in the unexcavated northern part of the tell, which is exactly what a 2020 excavation finally found. But I'm going to be generous here, and I'm going to give Dor an entire 8.5 hectares. In fact, for each site that we look at, unless specified otherwise by the archaeological reports, I'm going to assume that the entirety of each site was fully occupied during the time of Joshua. And when population data has been calculated by an expert, that's what we'll go with. But when it's not, we'll use the standard 200 people per hectare. And then, just to give the Bible the extra benefit of the doubt, at the very end, we will freaking double this number. But bear in mind that these are the absolute upper maximum limit of what's even remotely possible for these sites. So, according to the book of Joshua, the Israelite army of 600,000 men faced impossible odds. 7 nations, each more numerous and mightier than Israel. Armies like sand on the seashore. Massive fortified cities with walls reaching to the heavens. King Og of Bashan alone ruled over 60 fortified cities, each protected by high walls, double gates, and bars. The land was full of giant warriors, tall as cedars and strong as oaks, so enormous that ordinary men looked like grasshoppers besides them. They formed huge coalitions, fielding massive armies with advanced technologies like chariots of iron in an era before... No, I'm not going to be snarky and point out that widespread ironworking didn't even exist yet in the Bronze Age. We're only going to look at population data. And here's what we find. Let's start with the best candidate in support of the Joshua conquest, the city of Hazor. This city absolutely dwarfs every other late Bronze Age site in the region. It occupies a massive 80 hectare region with approximately 18,000 inhabitants, and it was violently destroyed at this time period. It is by far the best evidence in favor of the conquest narrative, and Christian apologists love to camp on this one data point.
The site of Hazor was identified in the 19th century. The archaeological data of the site aligns incredibly well with the biblical account.
In the Joshua narrative, we have a very explicit mention that the city's destroyed. So when we find evidence that correlates with that, that's a pretty nice fit.
In the mound of Hazor, we have this massive destruction, which is the end of Canaanite Hazor.
Joshua treats Hazor as the head of the northern kingdoms. The archaeological evidence indicates Hazor may very well have been one of the largest cities in Canaan in its day. More importantly, archaeologists also agree at the end of the Late Bronze Age, Hazor was destroyed by fire.
So if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck,
Yes.
we say maybe it's a duck.
Now, there's no evidence of Israelite occupation following the destruction, and the field director of the site, Sharon Zuckerman, believed that the city wasn't conquered by outside forces, but suffered from an internal conflict, possibly a slave uprising. This is because the buildings targeted were palaces, temples, and administrative buildings, not the workers' quarters or the entire city. The gates and walls show no sign of siege warfare, and they even found an inscription of a prophecy saying that a slave will rebel against his master. But the co-director, Amnon Ben-Tor, did attribute the destruction to a new emerging tribe of Israelites.
This happens, by the way, on archaeological dig sites. The principals on these dig sites often disagree. The directors of these excavations will say, this is the evidence, and I think that this is what happened. And someone else will say, well, I actually think this is what happened. These are the scholars that you want to listen to. The ones who say, this is the evidence, and I think based on the evidence, this is what happened, while acknowledging that this also might be a possibility. I don't think that's right, but this could be. But they're at least acknowledging all the possibilities.
So if Hazor is inconclusive, are we just at an impasse when it comes to the conquest?
To try to say this destruction level is evidence of this biblical conquest, when none of the other, or at least the bulk of the other evidence, doesn't match that. Not just from Hazor, but from the rest of the Levant, rest of Canaan, rest of Palestine. You have to look at the whole of the evidence, not at one piece, especially if you're trying to fudge different pieces of the data so that it fits.
I'll grant them this one because I want to look at all the evidence, not just one site. Now, the location for some of the rest of these sites in Joshua are completely unknown, so we're kind of forced to ignore those. But 9 of the remaining sites were completely abandoned in the Late Bronze Age. 4 other sites were almost entirely abandoned or shrank to a tiny minuscule part of the mound. The second biggest city after Hazor at this time was Megiddo, which was about 12 hectares and had about 2,400 inhabitants. Now, half of those would have been women. Half of the male population at any time would have been too old or too young to fight. And another approximately 15% of the fighting age men likely had medical conditions like scoliosis, blindness, some form of insanity, partial or total paralysis, missing limbs, bone spurs, or any number of hundreds of untreatable conditions at the time that would have rendered them useless on a battlefield. So, the maximum number of fighting age men even capable of combat would be about 510, but most of those would have been farmers, cobblers, masons, etc., and not trained warriors.
What is your profession?
I'm a potter.
And you?
Sculptor, sir.
You?
Undisputed. It's just so...
Furthermore, the city of Megiddo was continuously occupied and wasn't destroyed until 1100 BCE, long after the conquest dates. Only 4 other of these cities mentioned in Joshua had populations higher than 1,000 people at the time: Lachish, Hazor, Akshaf, and, well, maybe Dor.
If you squint.
It is highly unlikely that any of these villages could have mustered a fighting force more than a few hundred largely untrained troops. And then we get to Jericho, the grand fortified gated fortress inhabited by giants with walls so thick that people lived inside of them. The citadel that required an espionage campaign and an act of God in order to overcome. It was literally just 4.5 hectares at this time. And we're not talking densely populated hectares. It was a massively scaled down Egyptian administrative center, a shell of its glory days. Even if we give it the full 200 people per hectare, which is extremely generous here, that is a population of just 900 people in the entire city, and a maximum fighting force of about 191 people. It says that they spared the life of Rahab the prostitute and her family, but that's half the population of Jericho right there. Oh, and Jerusalem, which was apparently so mighty that the Israelites were unable to conquer it, it was literally the same size as Jericho at this time, albeit with possibly an even smaller population of between about 500 and 2,000 people total, according to archaeologists. You've got Libnah, which was barely more than a hectare, and Hebron and Debir, which were small hamlets no bigger than about 3.3 hectares with a few hundred inhabitants each. And finally, there are 4 other sites for which I was only able to find estimated ranges for their surface areas of between 1.1 and 5 hectares, but even with the largest size, all are still small villages and none are capable of fielding large standing standing armies. Now, it's important to clarify that for most of these sites, the location either isn't contested at all, or there's widespread consensus on the location. Nobody, Christian or secular, is arguing that Tel Gezer isn't the modern location of Gezer, or that Tel Es Sultan isn't the location of ancient Jericho. However, for some of these sites, Christian apologists and some scholars do propose alternatives. For example, at Tel, the widely accepted location for Ai, which fits the biblical description of where Ai should be and is really the only candidate for it, well, it was abandoned for centuries. There is a thick buildup of silt and sediment with zero evidence of any habitation all the way through the time of Joshua. So, in order to save the Bible, Scott Stripling and Bryant Wood, the archaeologists from the Associates for Biblical Research, a creationist organization akin to Answers in Genesis but for history, proposed that Khirbet al-Mightier was the real city of Ai. The problem is, even Titus Kennedy acknowledges that Khirbet al-Mightier was only about 1 hectare in the Late Bronze Age. But I mean, at least it's bigger than 0.
We are committed to the Bible, and we never use the archaeology to interpret the Bible.
Right.
The Bible is our starting point.
They do the same thing for Heshbon, swapping out the abandoned Tel Hesbon for the tiny 1.8 hectare site of Tel El Umairi. Some people think that Tel El Judaidah is Makkedah instead of Geder, but it doesn't really matter because both sites were abandoned in the Late Bronze. Tel Harbaj is proposed as an alternative location for Akshaf, but it's actually smaller, so that doesn't fix anything. And the alternative proposals for Dibur, Libna, and Eglon at best nudge the location sizes up by a couple of hectares. Even if we go with the largest surface area estimates and we double the population coefficients, Hazor is still the only city that even remotely fits the biblical description, and just barely at that, and maybe could have mustered together a couple thousand troops.
So if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck,
Yes.
we say maybe it's a duck.
Now, there are a lot of reasons why most scholars believe that the Joshua conquest narrative was actually written hundreds of years later during the Iron Age. And if that were the case, you would expect historical inaccuracies like this. And we do actually have written records from just before this time period in this exact region, in the form of correspondences written by the leaders of these very towns to the Pharaoh in Egypt. They're called the Amarna letters. See, Egypt ruled over this entire area at the time, and in these letters, they beseech the Pharaoh, asking him for tiny troop requests, indicating that sometimes as few as 50 men would be enough to subdue an entire region.
And Canaan of that time was an Egyptian province administered by Egyptian garrisons, where 50 Egyptian soldiers were enough to pacify an area according to the Amarna letters.
Which perfectly fits what we see here in the archaeological record. So while the biblical literalists in their little echo chambers are saying things like, I don't understand why anyone in academia doesn't believe the Bible is literal history, with all of this evidence at places like Hazor, but this right here is why.
If you come up in an academic circle where everyone is on the same page that the Bible is a myth or some assortment of various legends, then all your colleagues are going to think that the Exodus was a myth, and you're going to be taught that in your classes, and that's what you'll read in your books and in your articles, and that's just the framework that you're working with. And generally, that group doesn't really even look into the possibility that the Exodus could be historical. So they're not even looking at, maybe this is archaeological evidence of an aspect of the Exodus story. So it's just discounted.
Dude, I'm gonna fucking kill myself. Holy shit. Like, he can't read. Oh my god.
Now, ignoring the fact that so many of these locations have no Bronze Age evidence of destruction but show signs of continuous occupation, there are 9 of these cities which were completely abandoned during this time. Another 5 were the size of a pimple. 7 more would have likely struggled to muster together more than 200 largely untrained soldiers each. And discounting Hazor, the remaining 6 were almost equally pathetic. And that's not even touching on the fact that Deuteronomy says that Joshua conquered 60 fortified cities in the region of Bashan, all with high walls, double gates, and bars, in addition to a great many villages. But the archaeological reality of 13th century Bashan is stark. The entire region was extremely sparsely inhabited, barren wilderness. There were some semi-nomadic tribes like the Shasu and a handful of small forts guarding caravan routes, but 60 fortified cities? Aside from Ashtaroth and Edrei, you would be hard-pressed to find 6 proper sharper settlements from this time period. So what are we left with? Well, the Bible clearly describes 7 nations mightier than Israel, powerful kings forming military coalitions with armies too numerous to count, giants who made ordinary men feel like insects, 60 fortified cities in Bashan alone, walls reaching to the heavens, iron chariots, and a land so powerful that 600,000 fighting-age Israelite men needed miracles from God to prevail. But the archaeology shows abandoned cities and tiny villages, towns that weren't even built until the Iron Age, centuries later. Supposedly mighty kings whose entire military force wouldn't fill a movie theater. We find cities that weren't destroyed in this period, but were continuously occupied. The wilderness of Bashan with maybe a handful of watchtowers, and fighting forces that could be measured in dozens, not thousands. We're not looking at minor exaggeration or poetic license here. The mismatch between the archaeology and the Bible is glaring. The world described in Joshua simply does not exist in the archaeological record of the Late Bronze Age. On paper, it is a monumental conquest, but when you actually dig in the ground, the mighty Canaanite kingdoms evaporate into thin air. And the only miracle we find is that anyone still takes the conquest narratives as literal history. But what about all of the giants who ruled this land? Well, we'll have to cover that in a future video. So make sure you're subscribed and click that notification bell so that you don't miss it. Massive thank you to Dr. Robert Cargill for taking the time to talk with me. He does absolutely fantastic work. I've put links to his YouTube channel and most recent book below, and he's also doing a lecture at the upcoming digital conference New Insights into the Hebrew Bible about what archaeology can actually tell us about Genesis. I've linked to tickets to that as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and donors for your ongoing support. You're what makes this show possible. And as always, dare to be curious, but don't drink the Kool-Aid.